The war had ended without ceremony. There was no moment where the guns fell silent everywhere at once, no grand transmission that crossed the breadth of human space declaring victory in ringing tones. The war simply ran out. Fleets disengaged because there was nothing left to fight over. Worlds stopped burning because there was nothing left to burn. The enemy polities that remained intact signed instruments of surrender because continuing no longer made material sense. Humanity won the way it did most things at scale, by outlasting the problem. For 312 years, the Milky Way had been a ledger written in mass and energy. Every decision had been weighed in hull tonnage, fuel throughput, train personnel, replacement timelines. There were no miracle weapons that ended it, no elegant single stroke. The war was won in factories that never slept, in logistics schedules that ran decades into the future, in doctrines that assumed losses as a constant rather than a failure. When it was over, humanity discovered it had survived at the cost of being very, very tired. Entire population cohorts had known nothing else. Star systems that had once been cultural centers were now annotated in archival databases as irrecoverable. The industrial base still existed, but it had been stretched so thin that even victory felt provisional, like a long breath held too long finally being released. Andromeda had not mattered. That was the truth of it, stripped of all later irony. The extragalactic settlements, those three worlds and their surrounding habitats, had been seeded early in the war as an exercise in redundancy taken to an almost pathological extreme. Humanity had always believed in backups, backups to backups, plans that assumed other plans would fail. Jumping the galactic rift had been difficult, expensive, and dangerous. It was also, once solved, repeatable. The early test crews had joked about it in the way people joked about things that might kill them, gallows humor layered over engineering notes and checklists. When the first colony ships arrived on the far side, they did not find destiny. They found raw materials, empty systems, and a galaxy that, at the time, was irrelevant. The orders had been simple: establish, persist, stay quiet. If the war went badly, Andromeda would become a place to flee to. If the war went well, Andromeda would be something else. No one had defined that something else yet. There had been no need. So the settlers built, slowly, conservatively. They mined rocky planets with low biosignatures, dismantled moons that no one would miss, hollowed asteroids and spun them into habitats that were functional rather than beautiful. Everything was designed to last. Everything was designed to be maintained by people who might not see reinforcements for generations. Then the war dragged on longer than expected. The extragalactic holdings became static, almost frozen in intent. Supplies arrived irregularly. Updates came years late. Entire lifetimes passed without any meaningful change in mission parameters. Children were born who learned that back home was a place spoken of in stories and old data archives, not somewhere you expected to visit. When the war finally ended, it took decades more for the implications to propagate outward. Humanity was victorious, but the victory was incomplete in the way all real victories were. Infrastructure needed rebuilding. Trade routes had to be reestablished. Shipyards were full of half-modernized hulls, some of them older than the crews assigned to refit them. The industrial base was intact but strained, and the political appetite for another great mobilization was non-existent. That was when Andromeda re-entered the conversation. Not as a refuge, as a resource. It began quietly, the way most human endeavors did once they reached sufficient scale. A revised logistics plan here, a budgetary reallocation there, requests for updated surveys of extragalactic mining yields, dusted off from archives that hadn't been accessed in over a century. The people already there noticed first. They noticed when supply convoys started arriving a little more regularly, when equipment was newer, if not cutting edge, when the bureaucratic language in their orders subtly shifted from maintain to expand. They did not notice the galaxy watching them, because the galaxy had always been there, and it had always seemed uninterested. From the perspective of the Andromeda Galactic Council, humanity was an anomaly only in the way that small, quiet things sometimes were. The Council had been formed during an era of relative stability. It was not a government in the strict sense. It had no fleets of its own, no taxation authority, no enforcement arm beyond what its members chose to provide. It existed to talk, to mediate, to codify expectations, so that misunderstandings did not escalate into something expensive. Most of the time, it succeeded by inertia alone. When the first reports of a new starfaring species filtered in from the trailing edge of one of Andromeda's spiral arms, the reaction was muted. New polities emerged periodically, after all. Some burned bright and fast, collapsing under their own ambition. Others found a niche and persisted. Humans appeared on paper unremarkable. They occupied 3 systems of note, all of them resource-heavy and biologically sparse. Their fleet strength, as far as anyone could tell, consisted of a dozen or so warships, escort-sized by the standards of the major powers, and a larger number of industrial vessels. Their habitats were utilitarian, their trade minimal. They mined constantly. Council analysts noted this with mild curiosity. Heavy extraction often indicated either rapid expansion plans or a lack of alternatives. In humanity's case, there was no corresponding outward push. No attempts to claim new systems beyond those immediately adjacent. No diplomatic overtures that suggested long-term political ambition. They simply worked. When contact was made, a human delegation requested observer status at the Council. It was granted without debate. Observers were not uncommon. They attended sessions, listened, occasionally spoke, but had no vote. The human representatives were polite, professional, frustratingly vague. They presented population numbers that aligned with expectations, economic data that appeared internally consistent, fleet inventories that matched what long-range observation suggested. When asked about long-term goals, they spoke of sustainability, of rebuilding, of focusing inward before outward. Several counselors found this refreshing. Others found it suspicious. Suspicion, however, required effort, and effort required justification. Humanity did nothing overt enough to warrant either. Out in the habitats and mining colonies, life continued at a pace that felt almost aggressively ordinary. Shift supervisors argued with procurement about replacement parts that were technically within tolerance, but not good tolerance. Families adapted to gravity profiles that were close enough to Earth normal to be livable, but just far enough off to cause chronic aches if you weren't careful. There were jokes, too, old ones recycled and repurposed. Still better than the outer yards, someone would say when a system glitched. At least no one's shooting at us, someone else would reply, and that would be that. Alien traders who docked at human stations sometimes overheard these exchanges. They noticed the scars on hull plating that did not match local engagement records. They noticed that human ships, even the ones classified as civilian, were compartmentalized in ways that suggested survivability beyond what was strictly necessary. When they asked, they were told, truthfully, that much of the equipment was old. War surplus, the humans said, refitted, repurposed, cheaper to adapt than to build new from scratch, especially when you already knew how it behaved under stress. This explanation was logged, categorized, and eventually ignored. After all, everyone had war surplus. Everyone reused what they could. The galaxy was old and waste was a luxury. The first real point of friction came not from ideology or fear, but from accounting. A mid-tier polity on the edge of the Council's effective influence discovered that one of its long-dormant claim systems was suddenly very active. Automated monitoring stations reported human mining platforms operating at scale, extracting material at rates that suggested long-term planning rather than opportunistic scavenging. The system had been claimed centuries earlier, back when such claims were cheap and largely symbolic. No permanent installations had ever been built, no resources extracted. It existed on star charts as a line item and little else. Now there were humans there. The initial communication was cordial, a formal notice transmitted through appropriate channels, reminding the humans of the existing claim and requesting clarification. The human response took time, not an unreasonable amount of time by interstellar standards, but long enough to irritate officials who were used to deference from smaller polities. When the reply came, it was polite, dense with legal language, and frustratingly noncommittal. The humans acknowledged the claim. They requested supporting documentation. They noted discrepancies between different archival records. They proposed a joint review. In the meantime, operations would continue. This did not sit well. Within the council chambers, the issue barely registered. It was a local dispute, the sort of thing that happened constantly on the fringes. Precedent suggested it would resolve itself through arbitration or quiet compromise. Within the claimant polity, however, pride was engaged. To them, humanity was a minor actor, new, resource-hungry, and presumptuous. The idea that such a species would contest an established claim was offensive. Worse, it suggested that if left unchecked, others might follow suit. Internal discussions shifted tone. What began as a legal matter became a question of resolve. And all the while, the humans kept mining. The internal debate within the claimant polity unfolded the way such debates always did, slowly at first, then all at once. Its ruling council, smaller, more centralized than the Andromeda Galactic Council, had long relied on inherited authority rather than active enforcement. Their borders were old, their claims older still. For generations, those claims had been respected less because of fear and more because challenging them had never been worth the effort. The polity maintained a competent regional fleet, not large enough to project power far beyond its core systems, but sufficient to remind neighbors that ignoring its interests carried consequences. Humanity complicated that equilibrium simply by existing where it should not have. The analysts argued first. They brought charts and projections, fleet estimates and economic models. Humans, they said, were extractive but limited. Their industrial output within Andromeda could not possibly sustain prolonged conflict. Their warships, those that had been observed, were outnumbered and outgunned by local standards. The diplomats argued next. They warned that escalation could draw unwanted attention from the council. That precedent mattered, that even if the humans were in the wrong, force should be a last resort. Then the politicians spoke, and the tone shifted. If the claim was not enforced now, it would never be enforced. If a minor species could contest established borders without consequence, others would follow. Authority, once eroded, did not regenerate on its own. A limited demonstration of force was proposed, not an invasion, not war, a patrol reinforced enough to compel compliance. The humans would withdraw chastened, and the matter would end there. No one in the room believed this would fail. When the orders were issued, they were framed carefully. The task force would interdict human mining operations in the disputed system. Assets would be seized or disabled as necessary. Engagement rules emphasized restraint. Casualties were to be avoided if possible. The fleet that assembled was modest by galactic standards, but overwhelming relative to the humans' known capabilities. 3 capital ships, a screen of escorts, logistics vessels to sustain prolonged presence. The human mining flotilla detected the incoming ships hours before they arrived in system. There was no panic. There was, instead, a pause, a brief one but noticeable. The kind of pause that occurred when reality deviated from expectation in a way that required recalibration rather than reaction. "Looks like they're serious," someone muttered, scanning the telemetry. "About time," another replied. "I was getting tired of legal briefs." Procedures engaged. Mining drones were recalled. Heavy equipment was secured. Civilian personnel were routed toward hardened sections of the habitat. Automated messages were sent, not demands or threats, just notifications that operations were ongoing and that the humans did not recognize the legitimacy of the interdiction. When the alien task force arrived, it did so with ceremony. Transponders broadcast authority codes. Visual channels opened, projecting the image of a uniformed commander whose posture radiated controlled impatience. "You are operating within claimed territory," the commander said. "Cease operations and prepare to submit to inspection." The human representative who appeared on the return channel looked ordinary, middle-aged by human standards. No visible rank markings beyond a small insignia that indicated operational authority rather than military command. "We acknowledge your position," the human said. "We dispute your claim. Our legal department is reviewing the matter." "This is not a legal discussion," the alien commander replied. "You are ordered to stand down." The human sighed audibly. "With respect," they said, "this is very much a legal discussion. We are willing to continue dialogue. We are not willing to cease operations at this time." Silence stretched between the ships. From the alien commander's perspective, this was insubordination bordering on absurdity. He had expected hesitation, fear, negotiation, not this calm refusal. "Disable their platforms," he ordered at last. "Minimal force." The first shots were precise, controlled bursts aimed at exposed machinery rather than habitation sections. They should have crippled the mining operation within minutes. They did not. Human defensive systems activated with no visible change in posture. Energy dissipated across layered fields that had not been present in any previous scans. Mining platforms maneuvered, not clumsily, but with practiced efficiency, bringing armored sections to bear. Then the human escorts moved. They had been there the entire time, parked at distances that suggested irrelevance. Small hulls, unassuming silhouettes, the kind of ships analysts classified as local defense craft at best. They accelerated in unison. What followed was not a battle so much as a correction. Alien fire control struggled to track targets that did not behave as expected. Human ships absorbed hits that should have breached them, venting heat and shedding ablative layers without losing cohesion. Return fire was measured, almost clinical, targeting engines, weapons mounts, command and control nodes. One alien escort lost propulsion and drifted, intact but helpless. Another suffered cascading system failures and powered down rather than risk reactor instability. A third attempted to withdraw and was disabled before it could clear the engagement envelope. The capital ships fared little better. Their shields held, for a time, but they had not been designed to contend with opponents who understood exactly where tolerances ended. Within 20 minutes, the task force was no longer combat effective. The human ships did not pursue. They did not press the advantage beyond what was necessary to ensure disengagement. When the alien commander reopened the channel, his expression had changed. Gone was the impatience. In its place was something closer to disbelief. "This action will have consequences," he said. The human representative nodded. "We understand." The alien fleet withdrew, battered but intact enough to limp home under its own power. News of the engagement spread faster than anyone expected. Within the claimant polity, shock gave way to anger. The fleet had not been destroyed, but it had been humiliated. Losses had been limited, but the implication was clear. The humans were not what they appeared to be. Within the council, the incident triggered a flurry of discussion. Observers requested data. Analysts reran models with updated assumptions. The results were uncomfortable. Humans, it seemed, had more capability than previously believed. Not vastly more, not enough to upend galactic balances, but enough to complicate matters. Among the human settlements, the mood was subdued rather than triumphant. Could have gone worse, someone said, reviewing damage reports. Could have gone better, someone else replied, eyeing the list of systems that had been pushed harder than intended. Messages were sent up the chain again, not alarms, updates, notes appended to existing requests. Elsewhere, far from Andromeda, in places whose names did not appear on any local star charts, those messages were received, logged, and filed under a category that had not been used in a long time. Potential escalation. And for the first time since the war had ended, someone, somewhere frowned. The Council's response to the incident was, predictably, procedural. An emergency session was convened, not because the skirmish itself had been especially destructive, but because it had violated expectations. The claimant polity filed a formal complaint, complete with sensor logs and damage assessments. Humanity submitted its own report, dense with citations, historical star chart references, and politely worded objections to unilateral enforcement actions. Both sides insisted they were in the right. From the central chamber, the dispute looked small. One system, marginal by most metrics. No confirmed civilian casualties. No escalation beyond the immediate actors involved. By the standards of a galaxy that had seen entire sectors depopulated over less, it barely qualified as a crisis. Still, something about it unsettled the delegates. The human observer sat where observers always sat, slightly apart, close enough to hear everything, far enough away to be easily ignored. They listened, took notes, occasionally requested clarification on procedural points. They did not interrupt. Counselors debated language. They debated precedent. They debated whether the claimant polity's use of force had been appropriate and whether humanity's response had been proportionate. Some argued that the humans had acted defensively and within their rights. Others countered that refusing an inspection was itself a provocation. Underlying all of it was an unspoken question no one quite articulated. How had a minor power done that? The intelligence committees worked in parallel, reviewing every scrap of data. They noted that the human ships involved showed signs of prior damage, patched hulls, non-standard reinforcement patterns, systems that bore the hallmarks of repeated stress. These were not fresh builds. That detail mattered. It suggested experience, not training exercises or simulations, but actual use under hostile conditions, against peers, not pirates. Some analysts flagged this. They suggested expanding surveillance, updating threat models, revisiting long-standing assumptions about humanity's developmental timeline. Their reports were acknowledged, categorized, and deferred. There were, after all, more pressing concerns: trade disputes, border negotiations, a brewing succession crisis in a coreward polity that threatened to destabilize an entire region. Council attention was finite, and humanity remained, by most measures, peripheral. The official resolution was mild. The Council reaffirmed the importance of dialogue. It urged restraint. It recommended joint arbitration over the disputed system. It reminded all parties that unilateral military action was discouraged, though not explicitly prohibited. No sanctions were issued, no enforcement measures authorized. The claimant polity accepted the resolution publicly, even as internal discussions took on a sharper edge. Humans, they decided, had crossed from nuisance to problem. Within human space, the skirmish became an anecdote rather than a rallying cry. Damage was repaired. Mining operations resumed with only minor adjustments to defensive postures. A handful of additional escort vessels rotated through the area, officially to ensure worker safety. Unofficially, they were there to observe. Among the crews, the incident was discussed in the way professionals discuss near misses, with specificity, not drama. They were probing, one officer said over a meal that tasted faintly of recycled proteins and nostalgia, seeing how we'd react. They got their answer, another replied. We kept it clean. Too clean, a third muttered. They'll come back. That assessment was not pessimism, it was pattern recognition. Messages continued to flow outward, threading their way through channels that bypassed Andromeda entirely. Each one added context. Each one updated a picture that had been dormant since the war's end. Back in the Milky Way, those updates landed on desks belonging to people whose titles did not appear in any Andromeda database. They read, they compared, they remembered. The consensus, when it formed, was cautious. Humanity was not ready for another large-scale conflict, not emotionally, not politically. The scars of the last war were still fresh, even decades later. Entire doctrines had been rewritten to avoid repeating the same mistakes. But neither was humanity willing to allow civilians to be threatened over a misunderstanding that could have been resolved with patience. The problem, as always, was that patience was rarely evenly distributed. The claimant polity began quiet preparations. Fleet exercises were scheduled and rescheduled, each iteration slightly larger than the last. Shipyards that had been operating at peacetime tempo increased output, justified as routine modernization. Alliances were quietly consulted, not formally invoked, but sounded out for support should stability operations become necessary. Publicly, their representatives maintained a conciliatory tone. Privately, the language hardened. Humans, they argued, had demonstrated a willingness to use force disproportionate to their apparent status. This posed a risk, not just to one polity, but to the order the Council existed to preserve. If left unchecked, others might emulate them. The idea of a punitive expedition surfaced gradually, framed carefully to avoid the word war. It would be decisive, controlled, and educational. A demonstration that no species, however capable, was above collective norms. Within the Council, rumors circulated. Delegates from neighboring polities whispered about fleet movements, about unusually high-energy signatures detected near shipyards, about closed-door meetings that excluded even long-standing allies. The human observer heard these rumors too. They forwarded them along with their own assessment. Escalation likely, timeline uncertain, intent ambiguous but trending hostile. The response they received was short. Acknowledged, continue observation. On one of the human mining worlds, a rocky, airless place that had once been nothing more than a dot on a survey map, life went on with stubborn normalcy. Habitat domes hummed. Drones traced predictable arcs between extraction sites. Children attended lessons in rotating classrooms where the view outside shifted slowly, endlessly, from stars to stars. Memorial plaques from the Milky Way war hung in communal spaces, names etched so densely they blurred at a distance. People passed them every day without really seeing them anymore. The idea that this quiet place might become a battlefield felt abstract, unlikely. After all, the Council was watching. And humanity, by all appearances, was small. If there was one thing the Andromeda Galactic Council excelled at, it was producing the illusion of motion without the inconvenience of change. Committees formed subcommittees. Subcommittees requested additional data. Data requests spawned clarifications, revisions, and formal responses that took months to traverse the distances involved. Every step was documented, archived, and cited as evidence that the system was functioning as intended. For most disputes, this was enough. For the claimant polity, it was not. Their representatives attended the council sessions, nodded at the appropriate moments, and spoke eloquently about cooperation and stability. Outside the chamber, they returned encrypted communications to their home systems that bore little resemblance to the measured tones used in public. The human issue, as it came to be called in internal memos, was no longer about a single system. It was about credibility. They had run the numbers again and again. Even with revised estimates, humanity's visible industrial base within Andromeda could not sustain prolonged resistance against a coordinated regional effort. The skirmish had been embarrassing, yes, but not decisive. The humans had fought well, but small forces often did, especially when defending prepared positions. What mattered was scale. And scale, the claimant polity believed, was on their side. The plan that emerged was framed as a peacekeeping operation. A large fleet, assembled openly, would move into the disputed region. Its presence alone would compel compliance. If resistance occurred, it would be met swiftly and overwhelmingly. The operation would be limited in scope. Targets would be military and industrial. Civilian harm would be minimized, though not at the expense of mission success. This framing mattered. It allowed allies to support the action without formally declaring war. It provided legal cover under council norms. It reassured domestic audiences that their leaders were acting responsibly. There were dissenting voices. A handful of admirals argued that the humans' capabilities were still poorly understood, that the defensive systems observed in the skirmish suggested deeper reserves, that patience might yield better results than force. They were overruled. Caution, the politicians countered, had already cost them face. A decisive response now would prevent greater conflict later. Fleet mobilization began in earnest. The scale of it was difficult to conceal, even if no one tried particularly hard. Shipyards flared with activity. Crews were recalled from leave. Reserve formations were activated for the first time in decades. Logistics chains stretched and adjusted, drawing stockpiles down to levels that would have been considered unacceptable under normal circumstances. Across the region, observers took note. Some saw an opportunity to align themselves with a show of strength. Others worried privately about the precedent being set. Very few believed the humans posed a serious threat. They had, after all, only 3 worlds. Within human space, indicators shifted. Automated monitoring systems flagged anomalous traffic patterns. Energy spikes associated with large-scale fleet movements appeared in long-range sensor data. Trade routes that had been reliable for years became erratic as shipping companies adjusted to perceived risk. These reports made their way to human administrative hubs, where they were collated, summarized, and forwarded. The responses were restrained. No mass mobilizations, no public statements. A handful of permits were expedited. Certain maintenance cycles were advanced. Training schedules were quietly adjusted. To an outside observer, it looked like nothing at all. Among the humans directly responsible for Andromeda operations, the mood was uneasy but controlled. They had seen this pattern before, though never here. "It's the lead-up that always looks like this," one planner said, staring at a projection of fleet movements rendered as abstract vectors rather than ships. "Lots of noise, lots of signaling." And then someone asked. And then someone decides they're committed. On the mining world that had first sparked the dispute, the sky remained unchanged. There was no atmosphere to color it, no clouds to hint at gathering storms, just stars, distant and indifferent. The colony administrator, a woman whose career had been built on resource quotas and safety audits, not diplomacy, reviewed the latest advisory with a tight expression. Increased alert status, no evacuation order, no change to civilian routines. "Do they know something we do?" one of her deputies asked. "They know a lot of things we don't," she replied. "They always do." She authorized the installation of additional sheltering protocols, framed as routine upgrades. Drills were scheduled, described as compliance exercises to satisfy updated insurance requirements. Most colonists complied without complaint. A few grumbled, none panicked. Humanity had learned over centuries that panic wasted time. At the council, the human observer continued to attend sessions. They listened as delegates debated unrelated matters with forced enthusiasm. They watched as the claimant polity's representatives spoke passionately about collective security and the dangers of unchecked militarization, phrases that would have been ironic if irony were a concept shared equally across species. When it was their turn to speak, the human observer did not mention fleet movements. They did not issue warnings or threats. They asked procedural questions. What mechanisms exist, they inquired calmly, to prevent unilateral enforcement actions during ongoing arbitration? The questions sparked a brief flurry of discussion. References were cited, precedents examined. In the end, the answer was unsatisfying. There were norms, expectations, strong discouragement. There were no hard stops. The observer nodded, thanked the council for the clarification, and sat back down. That evening, they transmitted a summary of the session, along with their own commentary. Escalation probability increasing. Council unlikely to intervene directly. Recommend contingency planning. The reply, when it came, was measured. Contingencies acknowledged. Continue current posture. Somewhere beyond Andromeda, in systems whose names would mean nothing to the Council, that posture translated into actions that were not yet visible. Maintenance crews returned to hulls that had been laid up since the war's end. Engineers ran diagnostics on drives that had not been powered in years. Logistics officers reopened supply lines that had been mothballed rather than dismantled. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. Just readiness slowly, quietly returning. In Andromeda, the claimant polity's fleet completed its assembly. The commanders involved reviewed final briefings that emphasized control, restraint, and the importance of making an example without provoking unnecessary escalation. They believed, sincerely, that they were acting to preserve order. The humans, for their part, continued to mine. And the gap between those two realities widened, unnoticed by most, but not by all. The first official notice arrived on a routine cycle, embedded in a packet of regulatory updates and transit advisories that most human administrators skimmed rather than read in full. It was framed carefully. A forthcoming stability operation in the region, temporary movement restrictions for non-essential traffic, recommendations, not orders, for civilian installations to minimize activity until the situation resolved. On paper, nothing changed. Mining schedules remained intact. Habitats continued normal operations. Civilian traffic moved, albeit with slightly longer routing times and more frequent transponder checks. Beneath that surface, redundancies activated. The claimant polity's fleet crossed the final staging point and began its approach in disciplined formation. From their perspective, the operation was already a success. Intelligence reports indicated no unusual human mobilization, no calls for allies, no mass evacuation of colonies. The humans, it seemed, were choosing compliance, or at least resignation. This interpretation was reinforced when initial hails went unanswered, not out of defiance but delay. Human channels acknowledged receipt of messages, requested clarification, forwarded them to the appropriate departments. The fleet commander found this deeply irritating. He had expected more by now, more tension, more resistance. Instead, he felt as though he were pressing against a dense but yielding material, one that absorbed pressure without giving ground. Still, orders were orders. The first system to be entered was not the original disputed site, but a neighboring one technically uncontested, but close enough to make a point. Within the council, updates flowed in real time. Delegates watched the movements with a mixture of concern and resignation. This was not unprecedented. Regional powers flexed like this from time to time, usually without lasting consequences. A few counselors glanced toward the human observer's seat. It was empty. As the fleet advanced, its presence began to affect local systems in subtle ways. Communications lagged as traffic rerouted around military zones. Independent traders gave the region a wide berth. Insurance premiums spiked. For the claimant polity, these were signs of effective pressure. For the humans, they were reminders of how easily temporary measures became accepted facts. In the disputed system itself, the mining platforms detected the fleet's approach long before it crossed the heliopause. Automated threat assessments updated continuously, adjusting parameters as new data came in. The platforms did not power down. They adjusted orientation, hardened vulnerable structures, brought certain systems online that had not been active during the previous skirmish. The escorts assigned to the system, still few in number, still modest in appearance, took up positions that suggested neither aggression nor submission. They waited. On the colony world, the administrator stood beneath the dome and watched the stars. Somewhere out there, she knew, a great many ships were moving with intent. She did not know the details. She did not need to. Her job was to keep people alive and productive until told otherwise. A message arrived on her terminal, short, clear. Maintain status. Prepare for rapid sheltering if directed. She exhaled slowly and forwarded the relevant portions to her staff. Around her, life continued. The fleet crossed into the disputed system. This time, the hails were answered immediately. Human installations, the fleet commander announced. This is a stability enforcement action authorized under regional security provisions. You are ordered to cease operations and prepare for inspection. The human response came from a different source than before. The voice was calm, older. It carried the faintest hint of weariness. We acknowledge your presence, it said. We do not consent to inspection under these terms. We request council arbitration as previously outlined. The fleet commander's mandibles tightened. Your request is noted, he replied. It is denied. Weapon systems powered up across the fleet, not firing, but no longer concealed. On the human platforms, systems responded in kind. Not dramatically, not aggressively. Just enough. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the fleet commander issued the order he had hoped not to give. Proceed. The first shots were not meant to kill. They were calibrated bursts, tuned to overload external systems and force a compliance response. The fleet commander had emphasized this repeatedly in his briefings. The goal was control, not annihilation. The humans were to be subdued. The problem was that the humans did not react like a subdued species. The opening barrage struck the outermost mining platform. Energy washed across its hull and dispersed in a pattern that made several alien gunnery officers frown. That dispersion curve isn't right, one of them muttered. Before the comment could be escalated, the platform's defensive systems responded. Not with a broad counterattack, but with precision. The human escorts moved again. They did not charge the fleet. They did not break formation. Instead, they shifted, subtle adjustments that brought them into overlapping fields of fire, covering the mining platforms and each other. The fleet commander felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the sensation that came when a situation diverged too far from the plan. Increase pressure, he ordered. Target defensive emitters. This time, the fire was heavier. The mining platform shuddered as energy loads spiked beyond nominal tolerances. Internal systems rerouted power, shedding non-essential functions to keep the shield stable. Deep within the structure, warning lights flickered, then steadied. "Shelter status?" the administrator asked. "Green," came the reply. "No breaches, no atmospheric loss." She nodded. "Initiate partial lockdown, level 2. Doors sealed quietly. Transit corridors shifted flow. People were guided, gently but firmly, toward reinforced sections that had been built into the habitat from the beginning. They had practiced this. In orbit, the engagement escalated despite both sides' efforts to control it. The alien fleet began to take losses, not catastrophic but undeniable. Systems failed in cascading patterns that defied standard countermeasures. Attempts to isolate the cause were frustrated by the sheer speed at which human responses adapted. "They're anticipating us," an operations officer said, disbelief edging into his voice. "They're not reacting, they're predicting." The fleet commander ground his mandibles together. That was impossible. Prediction required parity, shared assumptions, shared doctrine. Humanity was not supposed to have that kind of experience. And yet, a human ship took a direct hit and spun away, trailing debris. For a moment, the fleet commander felt a flicker of grim satisfaction. Then the ship stabilized. Its hull was scarred, armor stripped away in places to reveal internal frameworks that were ugly but intact. Damage control systems engaged with ruthless efficiency, isolating compromised sections and rerouting functions without hesitation. The ship rejoined formation. The message was unspoken but clear: this is not new to us. Within minutes, the balance tipped. The fleet commander realized it not when a capital ship lost maneuvering control, nor when a second escort went silent, but when his tactical display began to lag. Data arrived out of sequence. Projections updated too slowly. The human ships were forcing his command systems into a reactive posture they could not escape. "Disengage," he ordered at last. "Pull back to minimum safe distance." The order rippled through the fleet. Some ships complied immediately. Others hesitated, their systems already compromised. One vessel attempted a turn too late and was struck along its drive section, going dark in a plume of vented atmosphere and superheated metal. The humans did not pursue. As the alien fleet withdrew, battered and shaken, human fire tapered off and then ceased entirely. No parting shots, no taunts, just silence. In the aftermath, wreckage drifted slowly, marking the boundary between what had been and what now was. On the mining platform, crews moved through damage control routines with practiced calm. Reports were compiled, prioritized, transmitted. "Structural integrity at 92%, someone said. "Primary processing offline but recoverable." "Any casualties?" A pause. "2 injured, no fatalities." The administrator exhaled a breath she had not realized she was holding. Across Andromeda, news spread. This time it did not spread as rumor but as fact. Sensor data, partial recordings, eyewitness accounts. The claimant Polity's fleet had engaged the humans again and had been forced to withdraw. Within the council, disbelief hardened into alarm. Emergency sessions were called. Delegates spoke over one another, their composure fraying. Analysts abandoned cautious language in favor of blunt assessments. "This is no longer a local dispute," one counselor said. "We are looking at a significant miscalculation." Others resisted that conclusion, clinging to the idea that the fleet had simply been mishandled. That with better preparation, greater force, the outcome would be different. The idea that humanity might be fundamentally misunderstood hovered at the edges of discussion, unspoken but present. The human observer returned to the council chamber the following cycle. They took their seat without comment. When asked to speak, they did not gloat, they did not threaten. They stated facts. "There has been loss of life risked unnecessarily," they said. "We continue to request arbitration. We continue to seek a resolution that does not involve further harm to civilians." The chamber was silent. Somewhere far beyond Andromeda, a series of status lights changed color. The humans had not wanted this, but they were no longer pretending it wasn't happening. And Act I, with all its assumptions and misread intentions, drew to a quiet, uneasy close. Shock did not arrive in Andromeda as a single moment. It arrived as a cascade of revisions. Reports were amended, then amended again. Initial casualty estimates were quietly walked back, not because they were exaggerated, but because no one wanted to explain how close a stability operation had come to becoming something else entirely. Sensor data was reprocessed with new parameters, filters adjusted to look for things that analysts had not previously considered relevant. Patterns began to emerge that made people uncomfortable. The human ships involved in the second engagement did not behave like a hastily assembled defensive force. Their movements suggested pre-planned contingencies layered atop one another. When one option was denied, another was already in motion. They did not overcommit. They did not chase. They controlled space the way veteran powers did, by shaping what the enemy believed was possible. Within the Council, this realization fractured along predictable lines. Some delegates argued for immediate de-escalation. Arbitration, they insisted, was still viable. Humanity had demonstrated capability, yes, but also restraint. That restraint could be rewarded, leveraged into a stable accommodation. Others saw restraint as a mask. If they can do this with a handful of ships, one counselor said during a closed session, what are they choosing not to show us? That question lingered long after the meeting adjourned. The claimant polity's internal atmosphere grew darker. The fleet commander was recalled, not disgraced, but sidelined. Officially, the withdrawal was described as a tactical repositioning pending further instructions. Unofficially, confidence in his judgment had been shaken. In its place, a new consensus formed. The problem was not that the operation had been too small. The problem was that it had been half measures stacked atop assumptions. Humanity, they decided, was not a nuisance to be corrected but a variable to be contained. Their refusal to submit to inspection was not merely obstinance, it was defiance. Their repeated requests for arbitration were not signs of weakness, but tactics designed to delay and entrench. This framing gained traction because it offered clarity. Containment required commitment, scale, unity. The idea of a punitive expedition resurfaced, this time stripped of euphemism. It would be larger, decisive, incontrovertible. It would target not just mining platforms but command nodes, shipyards, and, if necessary, population centers capable of sustaining resistance. The language was careful, but the intent was not. All appropriate force, the draft authorization read, to restore compliance with established norms. Within the Council, that language triggered heated debate. There were rules, written and unwritten, about proportionality, about the protection of civilians, about the dangers of escalation. Several delegates pointed out that humanity had, thus far, avoided civilian casualties entirely. The counterargument was blunt. So have they, a claimant representative replied, which means they can afford not to. The vote was never formally taken. It did not need to be. The Council did not authorize the expedition. Neither did it forbid it. That silence was enough. As preparations accelerated, they became harder to hide. This was no longer a regional fleet flexing its muscles. This was mobilization on a scale that drew the attention of polities far beyond the disputed systems. Some quietly withdrew support, unwilling to be associated with what might follow. Others leaned in, calculating that aligning with strength, real or perceived, was safer than standing aside. The claimant polity accepted all of it. Allies were welcome, Doubters were noted. Within human space, the change was felt before it was fully understood. Trade disruptions worsened. Long-range sensors picked up the unmistakable signatures of massed fleets moving with purpose rather than pretense. Communication traffic within the claimant polity spiked, then abruptly narrowed, shifting to channels that resisted interception. The human observer no longer attended council sessions at all. Their seat remained empty, a small but noticeable absence. Queries sent through official channels were acknowledged, then deferred. The message was subtle but clear. The humans were no longer investing effort in a process they no longer trusted. In its place, internal coordination intensified. On the colony world, the administrator received a message that did not come through normal channels. It was not long. Prepare contingency evacuation plans. Do not implement without direct authorization. She read it twice, then forwarded it to no one. That night, she stood beneath the dome again and watched the stars, searching for patterns she knew she would not see. Far away, in shipyards that had not built new hulls in years, activity resumed. Not frantic, not desperate. Deliberate. Old frames were brought out of storage. Systems that had been mothballed rather than scrapped were powered up and tested. Crews assembled around ships whose names carried histories that had not yet reached Andromeda. They did not look new. They looked experienced. And still, humanity did not speak. From the outside, it might have looked like indecision. From the inside, it was something else entirely. Within the claimant polity, mobilization was framed as routine readiness. Reserve crews rotated through refresher cycles. Fleet auxiliaries were reassigned under the guise of long-delayed maintenance consolidation. Shipyards extended shifts, citing backlog and modernization requirements. Each action, taken alone, was unremarkable. Together, they formed a shape that experienced observers recognized instinctively. A war footing. Those observers were not all alien. Human long-range monitoring picked up the change in texture before it resolved into clear intent. Not numbers, that would come later, but rhythm. Communications that had once flowed broadly now narrowed into secure channels. Fleet movements synchronized across systems that had no obvious reason to coordinate. Patterns learned the hard way, centuries ago, during a war that had taught humanity to read absence as clearly as presence. The analysts flagged it, the reports moved upward. The response that came back was short, unambiguous, and new. Begin Phase 1 preparations. Maintain outward posture. Phase 1 meant different things in different places. On paper, it was nothing more than a reclassification of readiness states. In practice, it unlocked authorities that had been dormant since the war's end. Personnel transfers that would normally take months were expedited. Equipment that had been designated legacy was recertified for active use. Training simulations shifted parameters subtly, introducing scenarios that bore a suspicious resemblance to Andromeda's current political topology. None of this was announced. On the colony world, the administrator noticed the change only in hindsight. The first sign was the arrival of additional cargo vessels, smaller than bulk haulers, optimized for speed rather than capacity. Their manifests were incomplete in a way that was technically acceptable but unusual. When she queried the discrepancy, the response came from higher than she expected. "Don't worry about it," the voice said, calm and professional. "Just make sure they have priority docking." She complied. The second sign was personnel. They arrived in small groups, staggered over several cycles. They wore civilian clothing or generic work uniforms, but their movements betrayed habits that no amount of disguise could fully erase. They mapped spaces with their eyes. They noted sightlines, choke points, redundancies. They did not interfere. They did not give orders. If asked, they identified themselves as auditors, safety consultants, infrastructure specialists. All of it was technically true. Feels like overkill, one of the administrator's deputies muttered after a particularly thorough walkthrough of a sublevel that housed nothing but redundant life support processors. Better over than under, she replied, though she did not quite meet his eyes. In orbit, the mining platforms underwent what were officially described as efficiency upgrades. Processing lines were reconfigured, power distribution was optimized, shield harmonics were adjusted to account for local stellar variability. The escort vessels assigned to the system rotated out, replaced by others that were, on paper, identical. In practice, the new ships bore the marks of long service. Their hulls were patchworked, not crudely, but with the kind of careful reinforcement that came from knowing exactly where a ship failed first under fire. Crew transfers accompanied them. Veterans, not celebrated ones, not heroes, just people who had survived enough engagements to internalize caution as instinct. They took one look at the system, the colony, the mining platforms, and said very little. The claimant polity, meanwhile, finalized its plans. The punitive expedition would be overwhelming, not merely superior to the humans' known forces, but so disproportionate that resistance would be futile by any reasonable calculation. Dozens of capital ships, hundreds of escorts, logistics support sufficient for extended operations. The target list was comprehensive. Primary objectives: human fleet asset, mining platforms, orbital infrastructure. Secondary objectives: command and control nodes, shipyards, transportation hubs. Tertiary objectives: classified, but understood by those who read between the lines, included population centers capable of sustaining resistance. The colony world was on the list. Not at the top, not as an immediate target. But it was there. When the final authorization was signed, there was no celebration. Just a sense of grim inevitability. Within hours, fleet elements began moving toward rally points. This time, there was no attempt to disguise the scale. The message was meant to be seen. Across Andromeda, sensors lit up. Even the most complacent observers could no longer deny it. Something large was coming. On the human side, Phase 1 preparations transitioned seamlessly into Phase 2. No alarms sounded, no broadcasts were made. But evacuation protocols that had been theoretical became concrete. Transport ships were reassigned. Shelter capacity was recalculated. Priority lists were finalized. On the colony world, the administrator received another message. This one was longer. It outlined evacuation triggers, decision thresholds, contingency branches. At the bottom was a single line, understated and devastating in its clarity. If contact is lost, initiate full evacuation immediately. She stared at it for a long time. Then she closed the terminal and went to speak with her staff. Out in the dark, fleets moved. The first indication that the situation had slipped beyond anyone's careful frameworks came not from a battle, but from silence. One of the human deep range sensor relays, an old platform, installed decades earlier and largely ignored by everyone except maintenance crews, failed to report on schedule. There was no alarm embedded in the failure, no distress ping, just absence. At first, it was attributed to technical fault. The relay was far from major traffic lanes, its hardware exposed to radiation and micrometeoroids for longer than most designs recommended. Failures happened. Then a second relay went quiet. Then a third. Each one occupied a slightly different vector. But together they traced a corridor, an approach lane that aligned uncomfortably well with the claimant polity's fleet movements. Human analysts did not panic. They did something far more dangerous. They assumed the worst case and worked backward. Within minutes, that corridor was flagged across internal systems. Routes were adjusted. Data was rerouted through redundant paths that were more expensive, slower, and harder to interfere with. The phrase fog of war appeared in more than one report, used not as metaphor but as diagnosis. Someone somewhere was actively shaping what could be seen. On the claimant polity's flagship, the mood was confident, almost buoyant. The commanders briefed their crews carefully. Humans, they emphasized, were capable but limited. Their earlier successes were the result of preparation and defensive positioning. Once faced with true scale, once deprived of room to maneuver, they would fold. The objective was not extermination. The objective was submission. The colony world remained, for now, untouched. Its orbital space was monitored, not contested. Long-range targeting solutions were prepared but not finalized. There would be time for that later, once resistance elsewhere had been broken. That assumption would prove fatal. The first strike did not come with warning. It came as a synchronized assault on human orbital infrastructure across 3 systems simultaneously. Mining platforms were hit with disabling fire. Traffic control arrays were overwhelmed. Escort vessels found themselves targeted by volleys that left little room for evasive maneuver. For the first time since humanity's arrival in Andromeda, human ships were outnumbered by orders of magnitude. They did not break. They fell back deliberately, precisely, into positions that forced the attacking fleet to spread its fire. Defensive systems flared and failed and flared again. Several human ships were crippled. A few were destroyed outright, their debris scattering silently into the void. Human command and control did not degrade. There was no frantic scrambling to reinforce threatened positions, no desperate concentration of remaining forces. Instead, the humans yielded space. They abandoned orbits that could not be held. They withdrew from platforms that had already been stripped of personnel. They let the fleet advance. From the outside, it looked like collapse. Within the Council, that interpretation took hold quickly. Emergency sessions erupted into chaos. Delegates shouted over one another, demanding explanations, demanding intervention, demanding to know why no one had acted sooner. A few voices urged restraint even now. "This is exactly what escalation looks like," one counselor said, Franz trembling. "If we intervene militarily—" "We have no military," another snapped. "We never did." The human seats remained empty. Reports filtered in from across the region. Human installations were being dismantled or seized. Fleet engagements favored the attackers by sheer weight of fire. Relief spread among those who had feared the opposite. Perhaps the earlier engagements had been anomalies after all. Perhaps humanity, when pushed hard enough, was no different from any other minor power confronted with overwhelming force. That belief lasted less than a day. The colony world's administrator was in her office when the alert came. This one did not arrive through official channels. It bypassed layers of protocol and appeared directly on her terminal, tagged with an authority code she had never seen before. Immediate evacuation. This is not a drill. There was no explanation, no justification. Just a list of actions, prioritized and brutally concise. She did not hesitate. The colony's emergency systems activated in full for the first time since its founding. Sirens echoed through the habitat, not shrill but insistent. Transit corridors reversed flow. Pre-assigned evacuation groups moved toward docking bays that had been maintained in pristine condition for a contingency everyone had hoped would remain hypothetical. Transport ships that had arrived quietly days earlier powered up, their holds reconfigured for passengers rather than cargo. There was fear now, real fear. But there was also order. People moved because they had been trained to move, because the instructions were clear, because, deep down, they trusted that someone somewhere knew more than they did. In orbit, human escorts shifted position. not to defend the colony but to buy time. They engaged the outer elements of the attacking fleet with a ferocity that surprised even their own crews. Weapons were pushed beyond recommended limits. Maneuvers were executed that accepted damage as the cost of delay. Several human ships did not survive. They died hard, bleeding energy and debris in arcs that forced the attackers to maneuver, to slow, to reassess. It was not enough. A capital ship from the claimant polity broke through the screen and moved into a firing position relative to the colony. Its weapons charged. The human ships could not stop it. The first orbital strike hit the far side of the world, far from the habitat dome. It was, by design, a warning shot, devastating in its own right but not aimed at population centers. The second was not. The administrator felt the impact through the structure beneath her feet as alarms spiked and then steadied. Emergency fields engaged just in time, preventing catastrophic decompression. Still, sections of the habitat went dark. Casualty reports began to come in. Evacuation was not complete. On the flagship of the attacking fleet, the commander watched the data scroll past and felt a twinge of unease. This was not how it was supposed to go. The humans were not begging, they were not surrendering. They were dying deliberately. And that made no sense at all. Far away, farther than any Andromeda sensor could see, messages that had been waiting in queues were released. They carried no emotion, no rhetoric. Just coordinates, timestamps, and a single phrase that had not been used in generations. Authorization confirmed. The colony burned. And humanity, finally, stopped holding back. The destruction of the colony did not register as a single event. It fractured. For those on the ground, it was noise and motion and sudden absence, pressure where there should have been none, heat where cold had always been, the disorienting sense of the world tilting when gravity failed, and then lurched back under emergency systems that screamed their protest in the language of alarms. For those in orbit, it was a blooming scar across the planet's surface, too large and too precise to be mistaken for accident. For human command, light minutes away, it was a data packet. Civilian casualties confirmed. Evacuation incomplete. Cause hostile orbital strike. When that confirmation arrived, the room changed. Someone closed a file. Someone else stood up. A third person, whose role was usually advisory rather than decisive, issued a directive without being asked. Begin escalation protocols, they said. Across Andromeda, human units that had been falling back received new orders. They did not retreat further. They did not regroup. They anchored. A claimant escort vanished in a bloom of energy that tore its drive core apart before containment systems could react. Another lost its command module in a single, impossibly precise strike that left the rest of the hull drifting, intact but blind. The attackers noticed the change immediately. What just happened? Someone demanded on a command channel already strained by overlapping reports. The answer was not forthcoming, because there was no single answer to give. On the flagship, the commander's unease hardened into something colder. He had been taught, like all officers of his polity, to recognize the signs of an enemy nearing collapse. This was not that. This was something else entirely. Pull back the forward elements, he ordered. Reform the line. The order went out. It did not fully execute. Human strikes began to sever the fleet not along its edges but through its center. Communications nodes failed. Logistics vessels, previously left untouched, were suddenly targeted and destroyed with ruthless efficiency. A fleet that had been designed to advance as a unified mass found itself segmented into clusters that could not support one another. And still, no human reinforcements appeared. That, more than anything else, unnerved the attackers. Where are they getting the ammunition? an analyst demanded. They should be expended by now. No one answered. On the colony world, the situation was worse. Evacuation ships lifted off under fire, some escaping, others dying in atmosphere as point defense failed under sustained assault. Emergency shelters that had been designed to withstand industrial accidents and meteor strikes were never meant to endure orbital bombardment. They failed one by one. The administrator did not leave. She coordinated until the last possible moment, rerouting survivors, overriding safeties, forcing systems to run past red lines because stopping meant death anyway. When the final evacuation ship cleared the dome, she remained behind, monitoring life signs that dwindled with each passing minute. Her last transmission was not a plea. It was a report. Then the channel went dead. The claimant polity's fleet pressed on, but momentum was gone. Each advance was contested more fiercely than the last. Human ships no longer disengaged once damaged. They fought until they could not, and sometimes beyond that, their hulks becoming hazards that tore into formation and forced course corrections. This was no longer a campaign. It was attrition, and the humans were suddenly very good at choosing where that attrition fell. Within the council, panic took root. Delegates who had supported silence now scrambled for language that could walk events back from the edge. Emergency envoys were proposed, resolutions drafted and discarded before the ink could metaphorically dry. "How many civilians?" someone asked, voice thin. "We don't know yet," came the reply. The question that followed was worse. How many humans? No one had an answer for that either. And still the humans did not speak. No broadcast went out, no ultimatum, no declaration of war. They fought and they endured and they waited. Far from Andromeda, in shipyards that had once built fleets to fight wars the galaxy had never known, the last locks disengaged. Massive hulls, scarred and ugly and unmistakably functional, powered up systems that had been tested 1,000 times but not used in anger for decades. Crews boarded without ceremony. These ships did not look new. They looked finished. Orders flowed, not shouted, not dramatized. Just acknowledged. Vectors plotted. The galaxy, for all its counsels and assumptions and carefully maintained ignorance, was about to learn a lesson humanity had paid for in blood long before Andromeda had ever known fear. The lesson was simple. There were limits, and they had just been crossed. The galaxy did not notice the moment when the balance shifted. Up until the destruction of the colony, every action humanity had taken in Andromeda had been, at least in theory, responsive, defensive, measured against an external tempo set by someone else. Even their withdrawals had been calculated to shape the battlefield rather than abandon it. Afterward, that logic inverted. Orders ceased to reference enemy movements as primary drivers. Instead, they referenced objectives, fixed points in space and time that did not change simply because an alien fleet advanced or hesitated. The attackers began to feel this almost immediately. Human ships were still outnumbered. That fact had not changed. What had changed was how effectively the attackers' numbers could be brought to bear. On the flagship, the commander stood over a tactical display that refused to settle into a stable picture. Every update contradicted the last. Friendly icons blinked out of existence not in clusters, but singly, isolated losses that should not have mattered and yet, somehow, did. "Reestablish command coherence," he ordered for the third time. The response was delayed. Not because the order had not been heard, but because the systems that were supposed to propagate it were busy trying, and failing, to reconcile conflicting data streams. "This isn't jamming," an officer said, voice tight. "It's selective, like they know exactly which links we rely on." The commander did not reply. He was thinking about the human ships he had seen die earlier in the campaign, how they had stayed in the fight far longer than made sense, how they had chosen positions that maximized disruption rather than survival. He was thinking about the colony, about the way the humans had reacted, not with surrender, not with pleas, but with something closer to grim acceptance. A terrible thought began to take shape. What if this was never about winning here? Within the council, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Emergency envoys were dispatched, only to find human channels unresponsive or delayed by layers of automated filtering. Council representatives demanded explanations from the claimant polity, whose own leadership now found itself struggling to maintain internal cohesion. What is your end state? One delegate demanded during a heated session. What does victory even look like now? The answer, when it came, was unconvincing. Compliance, the claimant representative said. Deterrence. The words rang hollow, because deterrence required credibility, and credibility was bleeding away with every lost ship, every inexplicable failure. A few counselors began to ask the question they should have asked months ago. How did humans learn to fight like this? The question went unanswered, not because no one had theories, but because all of them led to uncomfortable places. On the human side, the loss of the colony had hardened resolve in a way that no speech ever could. The names of the dead were logged, the circumstances recorded, responsibility assigned. But there was no public mourning yet. That would come later. For now, those deaths were treated as operational facts, inputs into decisions that were being made at a level far removed from Andromeda's politics. Human planners did not ask whether escalation was justified. They asked how to end the threat permanently, with minimal additional loss of life. And for the first time since their arrival in Andromeda, the answer did not involve staying small. Far beyond the reach of Andromeda's sensors, the first of the old fleets altered course. Their drives flared, not with the clean glow of new construction, but with the heavy, resonant signatures of systems that had been overbuilt and overtested, because failure had once meant extinction. These ships did not travel alone. They moved in formations refined through centuries of war, supported by logistics chains that extended across distances Andromeda's strategists had never considered relevant. They did not announce themselves. They did not hurry. Time for once was on their side. In Andromeda, the claimant polity's fleet crossed an invisible threshold. One more system fell under partial control. One more human installation went dark. One more step closer to what they still believed would be decisive victory. They did not yet realize they had entered the space humanity had chosen for the end of the war. And humanity, finally done with restraint, began to close the trap. They were being contained, not by walls or firepower, but by geometry. The realization spread slowly, unevenly, through the chain of command. Humanity was not fighting the fleet. Humanity was shaping the environment the fleet existed in. Attempts to break out were met with sudden, punishing resistance. Human units that had seemed thinly spread reappeared with uncanny timing, striking just hard enough to force course corrections that pushed the attackers back toward the same regions over and over again. The funnel tightened. Within the council, the tone shifted from panic to something closer to dread. Emergency communications from the claimant polity grew increasingly fragmented. Requests for mediation were sent, then retracted, then sent again, each version more desperate than the last. Council delegates argued not about what should be done, but about whether anything could be done. "We don't even understand the scope of this," one counselor said, voice barely controlled. "We are reacting to events without context." "That's always been true," another replied bitterly. "We just pretended otherwise." Whispers circulated. Old traders spoke of human shipping lanes that never intersected with known Andromeda routes. Scientists pointed out anomalies in human material science that had never quite fit local development curves. Military observers re-examined early engagement footage and noticed things they had dismissed the first time. Consistency, depth, the absence of improvisation. None of it looked like a species with 1,000 years of spaceflight. On the human side, the arrival schedule updated. No announcements were made, no fanfare, but markers that only human systems recognized ticked from pending to en route. The first reinforcement wave was not large. By Andromeda standards, it was almost modest. A dozen warships appeared at the edge of contested space, detected not by some grand arrival signature, but by the sudden presence of objects that had not been there moments before, their transponders broadcasting calmly, unambiguously. Human hulls. They looked wrong. Not sleek. Not uniform. Their designs varied subtly, bearing the marks of different construction philosophies and eras. Hull plating was layered in ways that suggested repair rather than aesthetics. Weapon mounts were positioned with a pragmatism that spoke of lessons learned the hard way. And every one of them carried scars. Not ceremonial ones, not stylized markings. Real damage, patched and reinforced, the metal around it darkened by stress and heat. To alien observers, it was deeply unsettling. Where did those come from? Someone demanded on an open channel before realizing their mistake and cutting the transmission. Human forces did not answer. They did not rush forward. They did not immediately engage. They took positions that closed the last gaps in the funnel. The claimant polity's fleet was now fully committed. There was no clean withdrawal path, no clear axis of advance that did not risk catastrophic loss. The commander knew it. He ordered a concentrated strike at what he believed was the weakest human-held region, a push that, if successful, might break the pattern long enough to disengage. It failed. Human ships met the assault head-on, supported by fire from units that should not have been able to coordinate at that range and speed. The engagement was brutal and brief. When it ended, the attackers had lost 2 capital ships and multiple escorts. The humans had lost 1 vessel, which detonated its own reactor rather than allow capture. That act echoed through the fleet. These were not the choices of a species fighting for survival. They were the choices of a species enforcing a boundary. Within the council chamber, someone finally said it aloud. "We are not watching a war," they whispered. "We are watching a correction." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Because corrections implied authority. And authority implied history. The galaxy had assumed humanity was new. It was beginning to suspect that assumption had been catastrophically wrong. As the battered fleet struggled to hold together, as human reinforcements continued to appear, quietly, steadily, in numbers that defied Andromeda's models, the commander faced a decision he had never imagined making. He could continue, or he could acknowledge that he no longer understood the war he was fighting. Either choice carried consequences. Neither offered victory. And somewhere far beyond the edge of Andromeda's awareness, more human ships, older still, bearing names no alien would ever recognize, adjusted their vectors. They were not coming to save humanity. Humanity did not need saving. They were coming to end the misunderstanding. Once and for all. The claimant polity's fleet began to fracture, not explosively but psychologically. Orders still moved through the chain of command, ships still maneuvered, weapons still fired. On the surface, discipline held, but beneath that veneer, cohesion was unraveling in ways no tactical display could fully capture. Crews started asking questions their officers could not answer. Why were human ships appearing where there should have been no approach vectors? Why did damage control failures cascade on their side, but not the humans? Why did every attempted breakthrough feel anticipated rather than opposed? The answers, when they came, were evasive. Unknown variables, enemy adaptation, temporary sensor degradation. None of it was satisfying. On the flagship, the commander convened a closed session with his senior staff. No aides, no recorders, just the people whose lives and reputations were now bound to the outcome of this campaign. "We need an assessment," he said. "Not doctrine, not optimism, reality." Silence followed. Finally, one of the fleet tacticians spoke, a veteran who had spent most of their career studying ancient wars rather than fighting modern ones. "This fleet," they said slowly, "is not being defeated." Several officers bristled. "With respect." "Listen," the tactician continued. "Defeat implies opposition, exchange, escalation. What is happening to us is closer to management." That word drew sharp looks. Humanity is not contesting space in the way we expected. They are allocating it, restricting our options, guiding us into positions where our advantages cannot be applied. The commander leaned back, eyes fixed on the projection above the table. "You're saying they planned this?" "I'm saying," the tactician replied, "that they planned for this, possibly long before we ever moved a ship." Another officer shook their head. "That's impossible. They didn't even know we existed 1,000 years ago." "Didn't they?" the tactician asked quietly. No one answered. Across the battle space, the pattern continued. Human reinforcements arrived, not in dramatic waves, but as steady accretions. Each new group slotted into existing formations with no visible friction, as though the structure had always assumed their presence. And still, no central command node revealed itself. There was no flagship to target, no obvious nerve center. Human coordination appeared distributed, resilient, frustratingly opaque. Attempts to decapitate it failed, because there was nothing to cut. The fleet commander felt it when the targeting alerts lit up his console, dozens of them, each representing a human firing solution that had not existed seconds before. They were not firing. They were waiting. That restraint, more than any explosion, broke what remained of his certainty. He opened a channel. Not to his superiors, not to the council. To the humans. "This is fleet command of the claimant polity," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "We request clarification of intent." The reply did not come immediately. When it did, it was not from a flagship, nor from a figure of obvious authority. It was from a ship whose hull bore the scars of multiple refits, whose designation suggested age rather than prestige. The voice that answered was calm, human, tired in a way that had nothing to do with fatigue. "You destroyed a civilian colony," it said. "Intent was clarified then." The commander swallowed. "This situation has escalated beyond." "Yes," the human replied, "it has." There was no anger in the voice. "That was worse." "You are now operating under a misunderstanding," the human continued. "You believe this is a war to be won. It is not." "Then what is it?" the commander demanded, frustration bleeding through. A pause. "Containment," the human said. "Correction and prevention." "Of what?" "Of you doing this again, to anyone." The channel closed. Across the battle space, human ships shifted, just slightly, enough to tighten firing solutions, enough to make the threat implicit rather than spoken. The claimant polity's fleet was alive. For now. But the illusion that it controlled its fate was gone. And as more human vessels continued to arrive, used, scarred, implacably calm, the galaxy edged closer to a truth it had never considered. Humanity had not come to Andromeda to conquer it. but it would not allow Andromeda to endanger humanity's future. Not again. After the channel closed, no one spoke on the claimant polity's flagship. The tactical displays continued to update. Human firing solutions remained locked. The fleet's own weapons stayed charged, oscillating in readiness states that burned fuel and crew nerves in equal measure. It was a stalemate only in the most superficial sense. The commander knew better. He had spent his life studying how wars ended, not how they began. Wars, he knew, rarely concluded with total annihilation. They ended when one side accepted a reality it could no longer change. The question was whether he would be the one to make that acceptance, or whether it would be forced upon him by someone else. He ordered a fleet-wide hold. No advances, no provocations, damage control only. Any unit unable to maintain position was to signal and be assisted if possible. The order was obeyed, though not with the relief he might have expected. His crews were too disciplined for celebration, too shaken for confidence. They felt the weight of the human guns pointed at them, the quiet certainty that if those guns fired in earnest, nothing they did would matter. Across the battle space, human ships mirrored the posture. They did not disengage. They did not advance. They waited. Within the council, the sudden pause triggered confusion. Delegates who had been bracing for catastrophe now scrambled to interpret silence. Emergency envoys prepared statements. Analysts revised forecasts yet again, this time struggling to model a conflict that appeared to have reached an equilibrium no one had designed. "Is it over?" someone asked. "No," another replied, "it's paused." The difference mattered. Humanity's absence from the chamber loomed larger than ever, without their participation. The council's debates felt hollow, like rehearsals for a play whose audience had already left. Behind closed doors, some councilors began to speak openly about contingency planning, about what Andromeda would look like if humanity chose to remain a permanent, openly acknowledged major power. The implications were staggering. Trade routes would shift. Security doctrines would have to be rewritten. Entire strategic assumptions about isolation, about scale, about the limits of technology would collapse under the weight of new information. And still, no one knew the full truth. On the human side, the pause was anything but idle. Planners reviewed updated casualty reports from the colony, refining numbers that would never quite capture the reality of what had been lost. Names were attached to identifiers, families notified through channels that balanced clarity with compassion. There would be time to grieve. Not yet. More reinforcements arrived, not near the front, but behind it. Logistics vessels that dwarfed anything Andromeda had built established supply corridors that bypassed local infrastructure entirely. Repair ships moved among damaged human hulls, restoring combat capability with efficiency that bordered on the unsettling. Alien observers watched these activities with growing unease. Those ships were not emergency measures. They were routine. The claimant polity's leadership convened in crisis session. The political consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. Markets reacted violently to the uncertainty. Border worlds demanded reassurance that their fleets would not be drawn into a war that now looked unwinnable. Allies hedged, offering support in words while quietly repositioning assets away from shared commitments. Blame began to circulate. The initial decision to confront humanity. The failure to reassess after the first engagement. The authorization that had led, however indirectly, to the destruction of a civilian colony. No one wanted to own that last one. A proposal emerged, not from the military, but from a coalition of economic and civil authorities. Seek terms. Not surrender, not capitulation. Recognition. The idea was simple and terrifying in equal measure. formally acknowledge humanity as a major power within Andromeda, negotiate boundaries, reparations, and guarantees, and hope, desperately, that this would be enough to prevent further escalation. The military leadership resisted at first. They argued that negotiation under duress would set a dangerous precedent, that showing weakness now would invite future challenges. The counterargument was blunt. "This fleet is already neutralized," one civilian leader said. "We just haven't admitted it yet." The commander was consulted. He surprised them by agreeing. "We cannot force an outcome we do not understand," he said, "and we are running out of time to choose how this ends." A message was drafted. Careful, formal, stripped of rhetoric. It was addressed not to the Council, but directly to human command, through channels that had only recently been opened enough to attempt such a thing. The message acknowledged civilian casualties. It expressed regret without apology, responsibility without admission of guilt. It proposed an immediate ceasefire and requested negotiations under neutral observation. It was sent. The response did not come immediately. When it did, it was not a full reply. It was a confirmation of receipt and a single condition: all fleet elements to power down primary weapons and hold position. The claimant polity's leadership debated this for less time than it took to send the acknowledgement. The order went out. Across the vast armada, weapon systems spun down, capacitors bled charge, firing solutions vanished from displays. For the first time since the campaign began, the fleet was truly defenseless. Human ships did not exploit this. They maintained their positions, weapons still hot, targeting data intact. The message was clear: trust was not yet earned. Within hours, a new presence made itself felt in the battle space. Not through dramatic arrival, but through inevitability. A formation of human ships, larger than any previously seen, older than any yet encountered, took up position at the periphery of the engagement zone. Their transponders identified them not as reinforcements, but as oversight. They did not point weapons at the fleet. They pointed them outward, to the rest of Andromeda. The meaning was unmistakable. This conflict would not spread, and it would not be forgotten. The galaxy held its breath. Humanity, having finally revealed the edge of its shadow, prepared to speak, not in anger, not in triumph, but in terms that would redefine what power meant in Andromeda forever. The ceasefire did not feel like peace. It felt like suspension. Across the contested region, time seemed to stretch and thin, every second heavy with unspoken contingencies. Human ships held their positions with weapons charged but steady. The claimant polity's fleet floated in disciplined stillness, engines idling, crews waiting for orders that might never come, or might come all at once. In the space between them, nothing moved that had not been authorized. That alone was unprecedented. Within the Council, the realization spread slowly that they were no longer the central forum of events. They were observers now, reacting to a dialogue unfolding elsewhere. Emergency envoys requested permission to attend whatever negotiations were forming. Some were granted provisional access. The first formal human communication after the ceasefire was not a declaration, nor a demand. It was a briefing packet, transmitted simultaneously to the claimant polity's leadership and to the Council's executive committee. It was exhaustive. Chronologies of engagement, sensor logs, communications transcripts, legal citations referencing Council norms and long-dormant precedents, casualty reports from the destroyed colony, anonymized but unflinching. The message was implicit but unmistakable. This is what happened. This is why it happened. This is where responsibility lies. There was no embellishment. That restraint unsettled the recipients far more than threats would have. The claimant polity's representatives read the packet in silence. For many of them, it was the first time the colony's destruction was presented not as an abstract, collateral incident, but as a sequence of human decisions leading to human deaths. Some reacted with defensiveness, others with shame. A few simply stared at the data and said nothing at all. Within the council, reactions fractured along familiar lines. Some delegates seized on the briefing as proof that the punitive expedition had been a catastrophic misjudgment. They called for formal censure, reparations, structural reform. Others focused on what was not in the packet. There were no fleet inventories beyond Andromeda, no industrial capacity figures, no strategic doctrine. Humanity had been meticulous about what it revealed and what it did not. "They're still holding back," one counselor murmured. "Yes," another replied, "and that should terrify us." Negotiations began not in a grand chamber, but across secured channels linking three locations: a council mediation hub, the claimant polity's capital, and a human command node whose physical location was conspicuously unspecified. The human delegation was small. No uniforms heavy with insignia. No obvious military commanders, just professionals, civilian and military alike, whose authority was implicit rather than advertised. They did not posture. They listened. When they spoke, it was with precision. "You initiated force during an active arbitration process," one human representative said calmly. "You escalated after being repelled. You destroyed a civilian population center during what you termed a stability operation." The claimant polity's lead negotiator bristled. "We did not intend." "Intent is noted," the human replied. "Outcome is decisive." Silence followed. The humans did not press. They did not need to. The conditions they laid out were stark but not punitive. Immediate cessation of hostilities. Recognition of human territorial claims pending arbitration. Reparations for civilian losses, structured over time to avoid economic collapse. There was no demand for territory beyond what humans already occupied. No call for regime change. No insistence on military disarmament. This, too, was unsettling. "You could ask for more," one council mediator said carefully. "Yes," the human representative agreed, "we could." They did not elaborate. Outside the negotiation channels, Andromeda reeled. Markets fluctuated wildly as traders tried to price in a reality where an unknown but clearly massive power had been hiding in plain sight. Smaller polities scrambled to reassess border defenses, not because they feared immediate attack, but because their old assumptions no longer applied. If humanity had been wrong about its place in the galaxy, what else was wrong? Within the claimant polity, political consequences arrived with ruthless speed. Officials associated with the expedition faced inquiries. Some resigned preemptively. Others were removed more forcefully. The fleet commander, whose decision to seek terms had likely saved thousands of lives, found himself both criticized and quietly vindicated. He did not care. On the human side, the old fleets remained in position, their presence a silent reminder that negotiations were backed by reality, not rhetoric. More ships continued to arrive, but now openly acknowledged, their transponders broadcasting calmly. Each arrival reinforced the same impression: these were not emergency deployments. They were assets being revealed. Slowly, deliberately. As talks stretched from days into weeks, one question surfaced again and again among alien delegates, though few dared ask it aloud. If humanity was this powerful, why had they waited? The answer, when it finally came, was not delivered in a formal session. It came in a private exchange when a council mediator, older, more candid than most, asked a human delegate the question directly. The human considered for a moment. Because Andromeda wasn't the point, they said. Not at first. And now, the mediator asked. Now, the human replied quietly, it's where people died. The words settled heavily. They were not a threat. They were a boundary. And Andromeda, at last, began to understand that humanity's quiet had never been weakness. It had been restraint. Understanding did not arrive all at once. For Andromeda, it came in fragments, policy memos rewritten in haste, military doctrines quietly shelved, economic forecasts rendered obsolete by assumptions no longer valid. Civilization-scale inertia resisted the truth, even as evidence piled up beyond denial. The negotiations continued. They were not dramatic. There were no raised voices, no threats thinly veiled as diplomacy. Humanity did not need to intimidate. Their position in space did that for them. Instead, the talks were painstaking, almost dull in places, bogged down in legal language and procedural detail. This, too, was deliberate. As days passed, the claimant polity's fleet remained immobilized under ceasefire conditions. Crews rotated through maintenance and rest cycles, grateful for the reprieve but acutely aware of their vulnerability. Human ships continued to shadow them, not aggressively, but attentively, as though the fleet were a hazardous material that needed containment rather than destruction. There were no incidents. That restraint spoke louder than victory ever could. Within the claimant polity's territory, the political fallout intensified. Worlds that had supported the expedition began distancing themselves, issuing statements of regret that stopped just short of apology. Opposition blocs seized the moment, demanding reforms, transparency, accountability. The phrase colony incident disappeared from official discourse, replaced by colony destruction. Language mattered now. Reparations negotiations proved difficult, not because humanity demanded the impossible, but because the scale of loss resisted tidy accounting. Lives did not convert cleanly into energy credits or resource allotments. Entire community histories had been erased in moments. In the end, the humans framed reparations not as punishment, but as obligation. Rebuilding is not optional, one delegate said flatly. Whether we rebuild together or separately is up to you. That distinction shifted the tone of the talks. Behind the scenes, Council analysts worked furiously to reassess humanity's place in the galactic order. Their reports grew longer, more speculative, and increasingly unsettling. Human logistics chains showed depth far beyond Andromeda. Human fleet composition suggested doctrines refined over centuries of peer conflict. Human restraint patterns implied not caution born of weakness, but of experience. One analyst summarized it bluntly in a classified addendum. Humanity behaves like a civilization that has already survived the kind of war we are trying to prevent. That assessment circulated quietly among senior council members. It changed conversations. As the negotiations approached conclusion, humanity made one final clarification. They did not announce it publicly at first. They delivered it privately to the Council Executive Committee and the claimant polity's highest civilian authority. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. We did not come to Andromeda to rule it, the human representative said. We did not come to dominate it or reshape it in our image. We came here because we needed redundancy, space, time, distance. They paused. That need may arise again. The implication was unmistakable. Humanity was not done with war as a concept. It had simply finished the last one for now. When the final agreements were signed, the ceasefire transitioned into something more durable. Reparations schedules were established. The claimant polity issued a statement of responsibility that stopped just short of confession, but far exceeded what most had expected. The Council ratified the accords with record speed. No one wanted to test What would happen if they didn't? In orbit above the scarred colony world, human ships lingered long after negotiations ended. Survey vessels mapped the damage. Recovery teams cataloged debris. Memorial beacons were placed, simple, functional markers that transmitted names and histories into the void. There were no grand monuments, just records that would not be lost again. Gradually, the old fleets began to withdraw, not all at once, and not entirely. Some ships remained, repositioned into patrol patterns that made no effort to hide their purpose. They were reminders, not of conquest, of limits. Across Andromeda, life resumed under new assumptions. Trade adapted, borders stabilized. Council sessions continued, though with a new, unmistakable gravity. Human delegates returned to the chamber, not as observers but as members. They spoke rarely. When they did, people listened. And somewhere beyond the galaxy's edge, humanity's vast holdings remained what they had always been: quiet, patient, and prepared. Andromeda had learned the truth too late to avoid pain, but early enough, perhaps, to avoid extinction. The misunderstanding was over. The consequences would last for generations. History did not mark the end of the conflict with a single date. Later scholars would argue about it endlessly, whether it was the moment the ceasefire was declared, the signing of the accords, or the quiet withdrawal of the last claimant polity capital ship from contested space. Each marker had its advocates, each its logic. For those who lived through it, the ending was less precise. It felt like a gradual easing of pressure, the slow realization that tomorrow would look more like today than yesterday had. That alarms no longer spiked without cause. That sleep came without the constant undertone of readiness. In Andromeda, the Council struggled to redefine itself. For generations, its authority had rested on consensus and the shared belief that no single power could dominate without unacceptable cost. Humanity's emergence did not invalidate that belief, but it complicated it in ways the Council had never prepared for. Humans did not demand reform. That paradoxically made reform unavoidable. Committees were restructured. Arbitration mechanisms were strengthened, given clearer enforcement pathways. The Council's lack of a standing military, once a point of pride, was re-examined. The claimant polity entered a long period of reckoning. Official inquiries dragged on for years. Some leaders were censured. A few faced criminal proceedings under their own laws. Most faded quietly into obscurity, their careers ending not in disgrace but irrelevance. The fleet commander testified before multiple panels. He spoke plainly, without defensiveness or heroics. His account became required reading in military academies across Andromeda, not as a lesson in defeat, but in miscalculation. You cannot intimidate a civilization that has already accepted loss, he told one panel, and you cannot threaten a people who have already buried worlds. That line was quoted often, usually without attribution. Humanity rebuilt. Not just the colony, though that effort was meticulous, almost reverent, but its posture in Andromeda as a whole. New habitats were constructed, this time openly acknowledged. Mining operations expanded, accompanied by infrastructure that made their long-term intentions impossible to ignore. Humans were no longer pretending to be small. They were also no longer hiding. Trade agreements followed. Carefully structured, mutually beneficial but unmistakably shaped by human priorities. Andromedan polities discovered that humanity was an exacting partner, demanding transparency, consistency, and long-term planning, but also scrupulously fair. They don't cheat, one trader remarked. They just remember everything. Cultural exchanges lagged behind economics and politics. Humans were odd, but they were present. In the years that followed, Andromeda changed, not dramatically but fundamentally. Expansion slowed. Claims were scrutinized more carefully. Unilateral enforcement actions became politically toxic. The idea that a polity could simply take what it wanted by force lost its appeal in a galaxy that had watched such arrogance nearly end in annihilation. The Council endured. So did humanity. And somewhere, in quiet offices and deep archives, human planners updated their contingency models. Andromeda was no longer a backup to a backup. It was a frontier.